Recognize Mr. Kim.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Kerry, thanks for coming on over here. And I know you've been peppered with a lot of different questions about China on a range of different issues. I guess I just want to ask you, what is your agenda? Well, with regards to this trip coming up forward in a couple of days, I think it'd be helpful for this committee to just hear directly from you, not just about all these other issues, but what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to raise? What are you hoping to focus on?
Well, because we've been interrupted several times over the course of last year, we haven't had as much engagement as we did in the last 6 months anyway. But what we're trying to achieve now is really to establish some stability, if we can, in the relationship without conceding anything. There's no concession. I'm not.
How can be places where that
We hope that's downpours that we see now that come because more moisture arises because of the heating of the ocean. 90% of the warming of the earth goes into the ocean. And now we're seeing exactly what happens with these floods as a result of that increased moisture. I mean, there's a clear scientific tracking of relationship here. What we want to do is find ways to see if China and the United States can advance the cause together for the rest of the world by accelerating rates of doing things, by increasing the deployment of renewables, by improving grid management. There are a host of things that we think are really worthy of conversation. And if we can make some progress on that, we think we can tampen down this edgy sense of competition, which could lead to a mistake which takes you to a place you didn't mean to go to.
You talked about methane a couple of times. We've also talked about COP28 coming up later this year. I guess I just want to get a sense for you. What would success look like at COP28? Or what are you hoping to see come out of that?
I think that there are a number of things. First of all, COP28 already requires a global stocktake. That is an evaluation of how the world is doing with respect to the promises that have already been made. Secondly, there will be an adaptation report, which will help to make a judgment about how we can accelerate adaptation for places that are really in jeopardy. Island states, vulnerable nations, they are the ones suffering the most, but they don't contribute to the problem, but they're suffering the most as a result of the problem. And then in addition to that, there is the finalization of the fund that was created, the so-called loss and damage fund, which is simply a recognition. It does not have any liability in it. We specifically put phrases in that negate any possibility of liability, but it is there to try to help some of these vulnerable, less developed areas from the problems that they're facing. Now, in addition to that, we want to see global raising of ambition. Everybody has to try to reduce emissions faster. We have set a very ambitious goal under President Biden's leadership. We're at 50 to 52% reduction in emissions, hopefully. We believe we're on track to be able to do that, even though they've gone up slightly in this past year. What's happening right now in terms of new technologies coming online, in terms of the reduction of coal, in terms of the capture of emissions and so forth, we're at least able to turn the corner and begin to reduce rather than increase. And we think we can meet the targets that we've set, which can help keep 1.5 degrees as the limit of the warming of the planet.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. And I will now yield to Mr. Moran for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you said earlier, this is a quote I wrote down when you were answering a question from one of my colleagues. We have 12 years within which to make decisions to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. In regards to that quote, then my question would be, what is the U.S. doing to force China to reduce its CO2 emissions?
Well, the 12 years, first of all, was set by the scientists. It's not my number, it's their number. They say that's the framework.
Regardless, you adopted that as truth today before the committee.
I adopt the best science in the world as a good guidepost for good governance.
So,
And I think that's what we need to exercise. Now,
you're the
let me
special
answer your question.
envoy on behalf of the president working on climate issues, and you take the position that we have 12 years within which to make decisions to avoid the, quote, worst consequences, then what are you doing to force China to reduce its CO2 emissions?
Well, I'm going there to start with, but I'm not sure that that presence alone is enough to force them. But we're
I agree
certainly
with that, it's a reasonable question. I mean, you've been asked to do this. I didn't ask you to do it. The president asked you to go abroad and to have this conversation with China. And so I want to know, what are we going to do to twist their
it's the
arm
use
so
of
they
the
do
word force. I think that it's important to have a dialogue about how you can both reach agreement to do
replace
things
the
that
word
are
force
sensible.
with influence? What are you going to do to influence China to reduce its CO2 emissions?
Well, we've had very successful rounds of meetings with them and have moved significantly. China, let me give you an idea of what China is doing now in response to some of the pressure that I think has been evident.
What
They
I
are,
want to get real specific about actions you're going to ask them to do. What actions are you going to go to the table?
Well, we're
and say,
looking at the
"We need
CBAM.
you to
I
do
told
this"?
you. We're looking very closely at the CBAM, as is Europe and other countries. We're looking at other ways to be able to try. But our preference is to have China say, yeah, that makes sense.
But
Let's see
China hasn't, because in the past decade, as you know, we've reduced emissions here in the United States, but in the same time frame, China's emissions have increased. All the while, they continue to say, we're working on it. And all the while, you continue to go over there and ask them to work on it, but we have not seen real deliberate action on their part to match the U.S.'s efforts in this regard. Is that correct?
We have actually seen some action which isn't evident to everybody because people, they don't advertise it. But I'll tell you what's happening. Let me just answer your question. China is deploying, manufacturing and deploying more renewable energy than all the rest of the world put together. That's what they're doing. China right now has about somewhere in the vicinity of a couple of thousand gigawatts, but they're now going up. And by 2030, our judgment is China may well be around 2,200, 2,400 gigawatts of renewable.
The pollution that's coming out of China far
Correct.
exceeds.
That's exactly why we're working at what we're doing.
And you
because
said yourself, quote, earlier, this is a global, universal issue, and we don't want it to become captive to other issues. But I'm curious, when you say that, if you're ignoring these other issues, like my colleague brought up here, human rights issues, would you agree that human rights issues are also global, universal issues?
Absolutely.
But you want to keep them separate when you're talking to China, is what you said earlier. Is that true?
What I said is, well, no, we don't keep them separate in terms of our priorities.
No, that's
I
exactly
go
what you said.
there
You said
when
President
I
Xi
go-
and President Biden agreed at the outset to separate out the climate issue
Correct.
so it wouldn't get caught up in these other issues.
Correct.
So were you correct
That
then, or
doesn't
you
mean
just-
you don't talk about them,
Well-
but it means that they're not going to become showstoppers so that they're playing one off against the other. I'll give you an example. We don't trade any component of any of those other issues for what we're trying to do on the climate front. On the climate front, we've agreed we will deal with that, and we have to find a pathway forward. And there are others, the Assistant Secretary of State, the Secretary of State, the NSC, who deal directly on those other issues. What
Okay,
we're
and I
trying to do-
presume that you're
you know what we're
having-
trying to do? We're trying to make sure that you don't have to worry that John Kerry is going to give away some right on human rights in order to get what he's trying to get.
So
on
I get
climate.
that, and I presume
that's what we're
I
doing.
presume that you're going to have conferences with your counterparts that are having those discussions on those other issues, and that President Biden has said to you and those others which one is more priority over the other. So my question would be: is human rights the bigger issue? Is the slave labor coming out of the Uyghur
Congressman,
people
this
a bigger issue,
administration
or
is
is it the
capable of
climate
keeping
change?
all its priorities on the table and of treating all of them simultaneously. But we don't have to wrap them up so one becomes hostage to the other, or you don't make progress.
You plan to
You got
hold
about-
China accountable if they do not follow through with the activities that you're going to suggest and to reduce their emissions, because they're able to get ahead of our economy by producing many more emissions and having less regulatory action on their businesses than we are here in the United
And we don't
States.
want that to happen. That is
Then
precisely
how are you going to
why-
hold them accountable?
Because that's exactly why President Biden has asked us to examine the countervailing
I have never
measures.
seen an examination hold anybody accountable. We need action to hold
Well,
them
that's
accountable.
exactly what's happening, and you've got several senators. You have some in the House. I believe there are a number of House members who are looking at the border adjustment mechanism. I know Senator Coons and some others in the House, Senator Whitehouse, have different plans for how to do that. This is gaining, I think, some steam legislatively because people are frustrated by what is happening. So, you know, you first got to come up with the legislation, and somehow it's got to pass the U.S. Congress writ large. So hopefully we can get there.
We don't legislate China, but we need to hold them accountable.
No, but you can legislate a CBAM.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Dean for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Crow. Thank you, Secretary Kerry, for being here and for your decades of varied and rich service to our country. As you point out, and as the world knows, the climate crisis is a global problem requiring global solutions, international cooperation. So you are extraordinarily well suited from your passion for this subject, for your passion for this country and our world, to be in the role you're in. We're lucky to have you. And I thank the administration for on day one, returning to the Paris Climate Accord, which the former president in June of 2017 walked away from. What a shame for our country that that happened. And I really speak to you today, not just as a legislator, but as a mom and a grandmom. I've got 4 grandchildren, and they're seeing the effects of climate change with extraordinary storms, smoke filling the atmosphere and hurting our eyes. In August of 2021, a crazy Hurricane Ida came up right through suburban Philadelphia, the 5-county area. Massive flooding, tornadoes, unprecedented for our area, suburban Philadelphia, and extraordinary loss and damage. I want to just draw a contrast because I absolutely share your opening thoughts about the opportunity in this moment, the absolute challenge of it, the crisis in front of us on so many fronts, but today we're talking about climate, but the unbelievable opportunity. I have the honor of serving on the Regional Leadership Council. We're working directly with the administration for the Invest in America bills to bring these investments to every single one of our communities. You pointed out the investments, the historic transformational investments through IRA and infrastructure. Could you give us a little more detail? The Inflation Reduction Act dollars, those transformational dollars, as well as the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and what this massive investment, and I contrast this with the last administration, never got any of these things done, never dealt with climate, just pulls out of the accords. We got massive legislation passed to make a difference for my grandchildren and their children. Can you emphasize some of those investments we need to make?
Well, the investments we need to make, happily, thank you, Congresswoman, I appreciate the question. The investments that need to be made are being made as a consequence of the Inflation Reduction Act. And there's a certain irony in it. The estimates are right now that about $338 billion of the targets of that act are being distributed in what are called red states, and there's about $180 billion that is going to what are called blue states. So the vast largest benefit is going to parts of the country where you have skilled workers who were in other forms of energy production who can readily be available and transition into the new technologies, whatever they're going to be, whether it's direct carbon capture or building out a storage capacity. I mean, frankly, one of the beauties, I think, of that particular piece of legislation is there's no one winner. It doesn't pick a winner. What it's doing is creating incentives so that people can go out and make their own decision about where they think the best opportunities are going to be. So a lot is happening right now. We have about 2,000 gigawatts of renewable power that is just queued up, waiting for approval. And what we need to do is find a way to bust that out. get it through the queue and approved, because that's going to generate even that much more energy and clean energy for the country. So that's one example of what's happening with it.
I want to pick up on that irony. It's not lost on any of us where these investments will go. They will go out with equity, not going out following the votes or the lack of votes that came for these massive transformational, generational changes. I want to just take you to some of the opening statements, and I wonder what your reaction was. I think at some point someone called you that you were carrying a far-left radical agenda. I have to admit to you, if anybody thinks it is radical to care about the protection of this planet for future generations, sign me up. It reminds me of Martin Luther King in the letter from Birmingham jail when he was called a radical and an extremist. He said, wasn't Jesus a radical for love? So I embrace the term radical whenever I'm attacked that way, when I'm focused on something so worthy. What are your thoughts? Are you embracing some far left radical agenda?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to hang myself. I think I am pursuing common sense for political right, political left, Republican, Democrat, because, as I said, what we're looking at is something that is human created. The problem we face right now comes from the way we inadvertently, it's the way the world developed starting in the middle of the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution, and we all accept, we've all benefited from it. Americans particularly have had the richest lives on the planet because we have the best health care, we've had so many different pluses that have come with the development we were able to create. Now, we've learned, as of 1988, alarm bell, problem. What you have been doing and taking for granted is actually destroying a lot of things on the planet. We lose about 8 million people a year to the quality of air, lack of quality, actually. Air pollution. Greenhouse gases are pollution. And that pollution is having an impact on the lives of our fellow Americans, negative impact. We're now seeing, because of the warming that comes with the emissions piling up in this, level of the atmosphere above the earth, it prevents the cooling from normally taking place. And so this warming is now totally documented. Everybody knows it's happening. Humans creating it. From the way we propel our cars, light our rooms and factories, heat our homes, that's what it is. It's the emissions. And if we can figure out, so you've sort of got a simple choice here. You either stop making those emissions or you can do something with them that's useful and doesn't harm things. And there is no proof to this date that we have the ability to be able to do that.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Perry for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman. Thank you, Secretary. In an attempt to get to net zero by 2050, do you support the administration's goal of cutting U.S. emissions in half by 2030?
Yes, I do.
Secretary, in 1997, the Senate voted 95-0, including you and then Senator Biden, in favor of the Byrd-Hagel resolution, which resolved that the U.S. shouldn't cut emissions until China, Mexico, India, Brazil, South Korea, and other so-called developing nations cut emissions as well. Do you remember that?
I do very, very well, because I was managing it on the floor of the Senate.
Since 97, have emissions from China, India, and Mexico all increased?
Yes, as they have from the United States.
And global emissions have continued to increase as well, right?
Yes.
Have any of those countries submitted a credible plan to get to net zero emissions by 2050?
Which countries?
Let's just go with China, India, or Mexico.
No.
It seems that, have you abandoned your position that those other nations would cut emissions before Americans would have to make choices between the groceries on their table and paying for these policies?
I think the reality is that the world changed in that period of time. Let me explain
okay,
to you.
So you voted that way, but
let me explain to you the vote, because I did manage this on the floor. And I know exactly what happened, because I'm the one who said to our colleagues, I think everybody ought to vote for this. And the reason was that it fundamentally had the message, that it's not fair. The one we were talking about earlier with the chairman, it's not fair for us to be reducing, and China, which was producing 3 times more emissions than us, and then producing goods that come into our country from that dirty power, and we have a problem. So we wanted to address that. But we knew not every aspect of that piece of legislation is what you all call, we all call, a message. It was a message vote. And the vote was clear. We wanted other people to join us in the effort to reduce emissions.
Okay, fair enough.
That hasn't happened sufficiently.
It hasn't happened sufficiently. Now, Secretary, in 2015 at the Paris Climate Conference, you said that if all industrial nations go to zero emissions, it wouldn't be enough. And then at the White House's Climate Day in January of 21, you said almost 90% of the planet's emissions come from outside the U.S. We could go to zero tomorrow, and the problem isn't solved. And in April 21, you told the Washington Post that even the U.S. and China going to zero emissions tomorrow won't solve the climate's problem. Then in April of 21, you said that global net zero is not enough and that CO2 must be removed from the atmosphere. How much is the correct amount of CO2?
Let me explain to you, if I can, so you understand exactly what I said. It's close, but it's not quite exactly what I was saying.
Can you
what
just
I'm
tell me
saying,
what
let
the
me
correct
tell you what I'm
amount
saying.
is?
I'm going to tell you what the correct. Here's how it works. Because we have put, I'd forget the exact number of tons, millions of tons of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are now in the atmosphere. They're there. And every day we're adding more. And so every day the heat is going up, and we have to figure out how we're going to, tame the monster here. The only way to do that is to reduce emissions on an ongoing basis to get control on the current level of emissions that we have created.
But
what
what
is
is
then
But
to
what
actually
is the correct,
suck?
Sir,
you're
with all
gonna
due
have to-
respect, you've been through
let me
this
just
before.
finish.
What is the correct amount? I don't want to spend a bunch of time about a history lesson about things that people don't care about.
Well, it changes every day.
What's
I can't tell you
the correct
exactly what
amount
it's
change
in the.
there?
Yes,
So-
it does.
So,
Because we're-
Secretary, you probably know that for approximately 200 million years, what's the parts per million now? About 400, right? Can we
it's
agree on
over
that?
400.
All right,
It's
for
about,
about 200
420.
million years, 2,000 parts per million. Did Mother Nature get it wrong for 200 million years?
Here's the difference, Congressman. The difference is, yes, there were periods which all the scientists who deal with climate acknowledge that there have been moments on the planet, which is billions of years old, in which there were greater heat and there was greater
Tell me the
carbon
difference
dioxide.
quickly. I've got a
The
limited
difference
amount of
is
time.
human beings are creating
so
this. That's the difference.
So human beings are
We are
about
creating
300,000 years old, but during these periods of time where it was 2,000 parts per million, life existed. As a matter of fact, we're in
not
one
people,
of the lowest
not
periods.
human beings
Mr.
walking
Secretary,
around.
We're in one
No.
of the lowest periods of carbon in the atmosphere in not only recorded history, in the history of life existing on the planet. In December of 2022, you told the Washington Post we need to remove 1.6 trillion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere via direct air capture. The cost for that is about $1,000 per ton, or $1.6 quadrillion. Now, you said you didn't know, but since 2015, since the last El Nino, about 500 billion tons have been emitted into the atmosphere. During that same period of time, 2015, if you look at the temperature graph, this is from NOAA. The temperature has gone down. Show the next slide. This is from NASA satellite data. Temperature has gone down. You want to have the American taxpayers, my constituents that are having a hard time afford their groceries, pay for a car, buy a new home, spend $1.6 quadrillion to fix a problem that A, doesn't exist, and as a matter of fact, you might be exacerbating because it's unknown. It is unknown at this time the low level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that might actually destroy life, because plant life all depends. As you know, Secretary, plant life all depends on CO2, and when we kill it, then we're done too. I yield the balance.
Congressman, let me just say that I don't agree with what you're saying out there for any number of reasons. I don't have time to go into all of them now, but I'll just tell you point blank that the difference between the periods you're looking at in terms of heat, et cetera, and human input is night and day, number one. Number two, Why do you think 195 countries in the world, their prime ministers, their presidents?
Because they're grifting like you are, sir.
That's a pretty shocking statement, that you believe that all the scientists in the world are grifters, honestly.
Not all scientists agree with you, Mr. Secretary.
98% of all the scientists in the world.
Science isn't about agreement. It's not about consensus. You know that.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Sherfilis McCormick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to start off by saying that representing Fort Lauderdale, who just experienced over 1,000 years of flooding that we've never seen before, that we most certainly know that climate change is real, and we're feeling the effects. And we understand that the work that you're doing, Secretary, is very important, and we thank you for being here. My first question is, earlier this year, I had the privilege of accompanying Vice President Harris to Africa to build on the commitments made during the U.S.-Africa Leadership Summit last December. During her travels, the Vice President announced over $7 billion in private sector and U.S. government commitments to promote climate resilience, adaptation, and mitigation across Africa. Last month, Beijing announced a major grant to offer South Africa with solar panels and generators. To what extent is it essential to improve our climate support of Africa to compete with China?
You know, personally, I'm speaking personally on this, I don't think that the choice we make with respect to Africa ought to be just based on what China's doing. It ought to be based on what we ought to be doing and what all of us ought to be doing. Africa, I mean, there are 48 sub-Saharan African countries, 48, that equals 0.55% of emissions. They're not causing this problem. But 17 of the top 20 impacted nations by climate are in Africa. Now, if we don't stop and think about that in terms of global responsibility and global politics, we're really missing something. And right now, I find the tensions between global north and global south are growing. And food production in Africa is threatened. Water is threatened in South Central Asia, in Africa, various places. And this is why the congressman who was speaking earlier about showing on his charts, you know, there's only one group of people in the world that I know of who are busy trying to tell people that this is not happening and it's fake, and somehow we're missing something. Only one group of people, and they're here in Washington, and some of them spread around the country. The fact is that all around the world, smart people, people who lead countries, who are responsible for the lives of millions of people, just like you are and we are responding to the clearly defined crisis of climate. So I think we have to look at this beyond China. I think we have to look at this in the context of what's our responsibility to the future, and what's our responsibility to our fellow human beings, and how do we deal with a crisis that has been brilliantly described over these last 30 years or more, where everything predicted is happening, only it's happening faster and bigger than it was predicted.
My second question is, according to the Biden-Harris administration, national security strategy, no region impacts the United States more directly than the Western Hemisphere. In June, Haiti experienced intense flash flooding, rock slides, and landslides that destroyed thousands of homes and killed over 50 people, combined with the ongoing humanitarian crisis and substantial gang violence. Many Haitians are looking to flee the country. Secretary Kerry, as the Biden administration focuses on the root cause of migration, can you describe how taking action on climate crisis can help bring stability to our nations and other nations where their citizens are looking to migrate?
Thank you so much for that thoughtful question, and it's really a major, major problem, because there are now climate refugees already today who are moving across borders and looking for different places to live. Some of the people, not all of them, but some of the folks coming from Central America and South America fit into that category. There are folks who used to farm, who now find they can't farm the products, the goods that they were farming, and so they're migrating. And one of the things that we learned during the course of the war in Syria was 1 million people moved into Damascus, which greatly complicated the war, but then they began to migrate and became a political tool, actually, and were sort of pushed to migrate into Europe and had a profound impact, a negative one, on the politics of Europe as a result. So this is a major issue, and it's one we have to really pay attention to.
Secretary, I want to ask you one question before we end, which is imperative. In April, Fort Lauderdale, which is in my district, witnessed unprecedented flash flood caused by the highest record rainfall in one single day. The flooding resulted in significant property damage, the closure of the airport, and shortages of gas all across South Florida. Recently, ocean temperatures in Florida Keys soared to 96 degrees, highlighting the impact of the rising temperatures on the region's marine ecosystem. Can you explain to us why this is happening and what is causing the increased weather and extreme weather, since there are people who don't believe in climate change?
Well, thank you again. I just might point out that I just saw this article this morning that Farmers Insurance has pulled out of Florida, affecting 100,000 policyholders. And the reason the insurance company has pulled out is because this unprecedented change in weather patterns, et cetera, has affected their ability to be able to make policies and for people to be able to afford those policies under the current circumstances. This has been a predicted happening. I mean, everybody's been talking about the potential impact on insurance, and now it is happening in various parts of the world. So, I mean, the reason, as I said earlier, 90% of the heating of the planet, which is documented, goes into the ocean. And that warming of the ocean then increases the moisture that rises from the ocean and travels around the planet with the planetary winds. And when it decides to fall in rainfall, it goes into the it is in much larger amounts than ever before because of the increase of the moisture. It's changed wind patterns and weather patterns, and the heating has other ancillary effects.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Issa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, it's a pleasure seeing you. It's a pleasure knowing that you're in this administration, and I mean that quite sincerely. I'm often disappointed in this administration. I'm not necessarily in lockstep with all of your opinions, but you and I go back a long way of trying to do the right thing. First of all, I wanted to get a figure you gave that I may have miswritten. You predicted, you didn't give the amount they have today, but you predicted 2,200 gigawatts in China by 2030. Is that accurate?
That's what our current estimates are showing. This comes from a number of different sources, but it could be more, it could be less.
But today, how many gig do they have, roughly?
Let me get back to you. I was actually talking with folks about that yesterday, and I couldn't get it pinned down, but I'll come back to you with a number.
Okay, yeah, it'd be good for me to have that because that's a lofty goal, but as you and I both know, you go to China, you see a lot of amazing, cranes, but then when you go back, you see the cranes in the same position. So it doesn't always mean that they're doing what they say they're going to do. In 2021, you said that you told this committee that trusting China in climate change promises would be stupid and malpractice. Without directly using that quote again, would you generally agree that it still would be malpractice?
I think trusting a lot of the players who've been involved in this, in government and also private sector, is not the smartest thing in the world because we've been burned.
Now, China is a country that buys all of the above, no question at all. They buy a massive amount of ours and the rest of the world's coal. They're increasing their coal. They're buying natural gas. They're putting in nuclear. And as you said, they're doing some work, considerable work in the photovoltaic that they produce. But India has a tendency to continue burning both dung and coal. You're going to China, but we had the head of India here for a joint session just recently, and he said a lot of great things, but he didn't say we're going to buy natural gas or do other incremental things to reduce the carbon footprint. Are we dealing with two problems, a China that it's malpractice to believe that they'll do what they say they'll do, and an India that constantly seems to say they're too poor to do what they should do to do any part of climate change reduction?
Well, interestingly, Congressman, and thank you for your comments, we have enjoyed working together on a number of things. India has set a very lofty goal of trying to deploy 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. That's their goal. And if India could succeed in doing that, India would be in compliance with the effort to keep, that would be a 1.5 degree plan. That would be really
and I understand that, Mr. Secretary, but if, for example, if India had simply switched its coal production to natural gas, they would have reduced more than that amount, and they would have done so at a lower cost. So isn't it fair to say that India sets lofty goals like China, but actions speak louder than words? So far, their actions.
Well, India is deploying. They're deploying. Their hope is to deploy, and their hope is to close coal. Now, they can't afford. They don't have LNG, and they.
Well, they don't have LNG because they haven't built the plants or signed the contracts.
Well, that is true. But on the other hand, they can't afford to do that on their own. They weren't able to at that point in time. India is growing now. Its economy is growing. The visit here produced some significant joint initiatives going forward. I am actually going to India before the end of this month to follow up on the conversations we had with both the Prime Minister being here, but also before that with some of his other.
Okay, and if I can squeeze in one more quick question. You know, you're going to meet in China with a number of leaders, but the president called Xi Jinping, called him a dictator. Do you believe he wields the power of a dictator today in China? Meaning, is his ability is similar to Putin's ability to affect what he says he will do, such that if he makes a promise, he can keep it?
There's no question at all that President Xi is the major decider of the direction and of the policies of
Is he,
China.
in fact, effectively a dictator?
Well, I'm not, I don't think it's useful to get into, I'm not going to get into.
But he does wield the power of
He wields enormous power as the leader of China, absolutely, and everybody understands that. But I don't, it doesn't.
Do you wish the president had used another word?
No, I don't even, I just, frankly, all of that is sort of like water off the duck's back, and I don't think we ought to get tangled up in, labels and names and whatever. What we ought to do is look at the heart of what we're trying to do. President Biden actually has a very good relationship with President Xi, and President Xi vice versa. I think he honors the relationship he has with President Biden. And I think in Secretary Blinken's visit to China, and subsequently in Janet Yellen's visit with China, where you saw in her own statements publicly and assessments, there was frank conversation. But the effort is well underway now to try to stabilize and avoid conflict by virtue of unforeseen consequences or mistakes.
Chair now recognizes.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask one follow? It doesn't require, but would you commit, when you have had those meetings with India and China, to, in writing or in some other way, report back to us so we have an update on the
Sure,
effect
be
of
happy
those?
to.
I thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. Chair now recognizes Ms. Titus for 5 minutes.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you go towards the end, there are not many questions left to ask, but you have the luxury of having heard everything gone before and kind of reached some conclusions. One thing I heard was my colleague on the other side called the Secretary, most of the scientists in the world, and the heads of 195 countries who belong to the UN climate agreement, grifters. Now, that's something that should be taken down, but since he's gone in his typical hit-and-run fashion, it wouldn't be much point. Now, the arguments that I've heard from both sides, on the other side of the aisle we hear, you can't make China do anything. You can't force China to do anything. You can't impose any restrictions on China. Therefore, we shouldn't be doing anything in the United States. On the other hand, when you're getting ready to go to China and try to negotiate something or make some points or try to influence their decision, they don't want you to go. They think that's not a good idea. Also, we hear that you have a pro-China, not a pro-American approach, and you are not helping U.S. business and workers. On the other hand, these people who are saying this voted against the Inflation Reduction Act, which made a big investment in manufacturing and workers and solar energy panels that we don't have to get from the Uyghurs, but can be made here. Speaking of the Uyghurs, there's a real now sudden interest in human rights of the Uyghurs, but it doesn't bother them too much to deal with Saudi Arabia when it comes to these issues. Also, we know that this is a world issue. Climate change affects everything from demographics to politics to economics, and yet we're not looking at the rest of the world. It's as though only the U.S. and China exist on the globe. So I would ask you, Mr. Secretary, because climate change and energy policy is so pervasive in everything we do, it's not just about dealing with the next storm or the next wildfire. It has so much of an impact on peacekeeping, on development of foreign countries, on our role internationally. Are what you're hearing from the other side diminishing our influence, hurting our role as we try to kind of move back into being an international leader, kind of upsetting some of our NATO relations because of what Europe is doing and what we're not? Are the cuts in the budget going to make a difference because we can't now invest what the President would like to see us do to help the rest of the world with these global problems? Would you just address that sort of thing for us?
Well, Congresswoman, thank you very much. Let me just say I've got the figures delivered to me here. If I take 15 seconds on this. China, according to the International Energy Agency, by 2030, China will have somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 gigawatts of renewable energy. That's by fathoms larger than any other country in the planet. And so they're moving very aggressively in that regard. With respect to look, people really do count on America for a lot of things in the world. And I think everyone should be extraordinarily proud of our history of doing things. We're the largest humanitarian donor in the world. And you look at what we've done with AIDS in Africa or Ebola or, through various counterterrorism efforts, other things. But we also, for a long period of time, projected, and this is sort of the soft power projection, but we also, we helped people develop. We helped people do more. That's been retreating in the last years. We're now giving less than a lot of other countries are doing in order to help, particularly on climate. And I think it does have an impact. I think that people ask questions. I certainly hear these questions. Why aren't you doing that? Why aren't you more present? Why aren't you? Look at who's giving us help here, and so forth. So I think that, you can't just sit there anywhere and wish that things are going to be as they have been historically. You have to invest in it. You have to actually proactively have people on the ground. You have to build relationships. You have to do things that people see you doing, not just on an economic competitive basis, but because it's the right thing to do. And I think we've fallen a little behind on that. I know President Biden feels very strongly about living up to our commitments and our values.
Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. The chair now recognizes Mr. Waltz for 5 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, in exchange with Mr. Mills, you just testified under oath that you never owned a private jet. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record article here from February 15th of 2023 The John Kerry family private jet was sold shortly after accusations of climate hypocrisy. Mr. Secretary, do you stand by that testimony that you've never owned or
I personally,
your family? By your family?
Personally, yes. My wife owned a plane and sold the plane.
You flew on
That's
that plane?
Not in a number of years, but I have flown on it,
And
sure.
this article is not then inaccurate, that your family owned a plane, you flew on a plane.
My
Mr.
wife
Secretary,
owned,
Mr. Secretary,
my wife owned a
here's
plane.
here's the issue.
Yeah.
This isn't some kind of partisan gotcha. When we are asking Americans to make serious sacrifices as we transition for the common good, and your family and or yourself are flying around on private jets, that smacks of hypocrisy. It actually hurts your cause, Mr. Secretary, but I'll move on. I just want to know from a record standpoint.
Afford me the right, at least, to set the record straight here. I do not fly on a private jet. I do not fly. I fly commercially.
Have you
on
flown
all
on a
of my
private jet since you've
responsibilities.
taken this position?
Just let me just finish. I have flown 5 times in the last 2.5 years on Mill-Air, which you also fly on,
Sure.
and or some of you who travel fly on, 5 times. Otherwise, all of my trips are commercial
Have you
airlines.
flown on a private jet in a personal or official capacity since you've taken this position?
Possibly once. I just don't, I'm trying to think of
I
the date.
think you need to take the broader point of how this appears to the American people
But no,
as
it
we're asking
shouldn't
them to
appear
take
that. Let
that.
me tell you why.
We're
not asking
these
Americans.
testimonies?
We're not asking Americans not to fly.
You know,
You're trying to create an unequal thing. We're not
no, we're
saying
asking
don't
you
fly.
to lead by example, Mr. Secretary. That's what we're at. You,
Which is
your
why I
family,
fly
and others to lead
commercially.
by example.
Which is why I fly.
In that
commercially.
vein, does your office or the State Department keep a record of your official travel and scheduled meetings?
Of course.
Does that include the individuals you're scheduled to meet with? Can you provide those records to Congress? Will you provide those records to Congress?
Of who I've met with?
Your official travel, taxpayer funded while in this position.
Sure, happy to do so.
Thank you. I appreciate that commitment. Switching topics here to some of the other diplomacy you've conducted. In a 2018 interview, you admitted to speaking with Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, quote, 3 or 4 times from the start of the previous administration. How many times did you speak with the foreign minister, the Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, during the last administration? And I'll enter into the record, Mr. Chairman,
Without objection.
that 3 or 4 times. So let's take that at face value. Did you communicate with him using Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, any other?
I don't recall how I communicated with him. I met him formally in the course of international, specifically I think it was at UNGA in New York. I saw him in Munich at the Munich Security Conference, which he was invited to.
According to
leaked
audio provided by the New York Times, Zarif said you told him that Israel attacked Iranian assets in Syria at least, quote, at least 200 times, and Zarif was surprised you would reveal such sensitive information. Now, that was according to leaked audio. Now under oath, do you stand by your previous denial that that ever happened?
I absolutely stand by. On the day that report came out, we made it crystal clear in a release that we put out that never took place. It was at a time when there was public discussion of those attacks. It was in public circulation. Now, I don't know what he's confusing or what he did, but I can tell you that I never had that conversation, and I can tell you that in 5 years running one of the largest prosecutor's offices in America, in 2 years as lieutenant governor, in 28 years in the Senate, as a member of the Intelligence Committee, as a
This is why I'm going. I only have a few
State,
seconds left.
nobody ever
Secretary.
questioned.
This is why I'm raising that issue. Would you find it appropriate if a former Trump administration official traveled around and talked to the same officials you are and said, you don't have to abide by these agreements, hold fast till 2024, a new regime or a new administration may be coming in, and therefore undermining current administration diplomacy. Would you find that appropriate?
I'm not going to speak to any hypotheticals, but I can tell you I never engaged in that.
Shadow diplomacy undermines American goals.
Shadow diplomacy, depending on what involved. Shadow diplomacy has also saved us from a war. If you look at 1963 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was behind the scenes, back
Mr.
channel
Secretary, I would posture that your shadow diplomacy now has us on the verge
I
of
wasn't
Iran
conducting
having
shadow
a nuclear
diplomacy.
weapon
I was at a security conference.
that is now exploding as they race towards full enrichment from 20% to 60%, on the verge of having a nuclear weapon and a nuclear arms race in the Middle East.
And the reason that has happened is that
As
Donald
Americans,
Trump pulled
we don't
out of the
undermine
agreement.
other administrations.
The reason that happened, my friend, is because Donald Trump pulled out of that agreement. There was no way they could have had a nuclear weapon under the agreement that existed. And even in Israel, the security establishment of Israel believed that agreement had done the job. President Trump just pulled out.
Chair now
Gave it away.
recognizes Mr. Schneider for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and Special Envoy, Secretary Kerry, thank you for your time today. Earlier, we had an exchange that I guess I can only describe as childish, but I thought I would engage a little bit on the science. How old's the Earth?
I don't remember how many billions, but
4.5.
billions.
I'll answer. It's 4.5 billion years, or in another way of looking at it, 4,500,000 millennium. And I used to, with my kids, walk through an exercise if the Earth was a year old, where things play. And just some of the numbers on that, if the Earth was a year old and formed in January 1st, it would be mid-February when life arose on Earth. It would be sometime in mid-November where the fish started swimming in the oceans. The dinosaurs would have gone extinct around Christmas, and all of human existence would have been captured in the last hour of the last day of the year. So this idea of comparing numbers from long ago, human existence is a relatively very short period of Earth's existence. The other thing in this, Mr. Secretary, just to state the obvious, is there a difference between life existing on Earth and civilization thriving on Earth?
Sure.
And is what we're talking about addressing climate change, making sure we're doing everything we can to ensure that civilization, society, America continues to thrive on Earth?
Indeed.
Okay. Just another statistic I'll point out, 40% of all people on Earth live within 100 kilometers or 62 miles of a coast. In the United States, that number is 50% of all Americans live within 50 miles of the coast. And in some of the notes in preparing for this last night, I read that the first experience of climate change is oftentimes with water, whether it's too much or too little. I think that is one of the key things we face. It's our biggest threat to our nation, climate change is, to our way of life, to world, to the civilization, and halting the displacement, instability, and myriad of other consequences, I think, is the greatest challenge, or one of the greatest challenges we face. So thank you for your leadership in addressing this. And I know in Congress, last Congress, we passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Jobs Act. We passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is being accorded as the greatest to date investment. And one of the pieces of that I'm very proud of was the work we're doing on sustainable aviation fuel. We have to eliminate or reduce greenhouse emissions every way we can. We can electrify our ground fleet. Our air fleet will be something different. Secretary, can you talk about how we're working with our friends, as well as our adversaries or competitors, to ensure that we're doing everything we can to reduce greenhouse emissions for the long term?
Well, Congressman, thank you. I mean, obviously, the entire UN process is geared to bring people together around a common goal. And that goal is to try to keep the Earth's temperature increase limited to 1.5 degrees. Why 1.5 degrees? Because, again, the scientists have running all the models, a myriad of models, by the way, which show what the damage is to Earth at certain levels of temperature. And so that is our goal. And the only way to achieve that goal is by coming together on a multinational basis in order to negotiate some common sense approach as to how we're going to deal with this. Now, 20 countries, the 20 largest economies on the planet, equal, shy of 80% of all the emissions. 20 countries are the principal cause of what is happening today. 10 of those countries or so have all agreed to plans to try to reduce emissions to keep the 1.5. We're still working with other countries to empower them to be able to do that. If a country is entirely dependent on coal today, they're not going to shut their economy down overnight. So we've got to try to find a way in common enterprise for all of our lives, for life on the planet, to help some of those countries to be able to make that transition. And we're getting a little stuck there because some people just don't want to do that.
So, and I just want to reclaim my time to make two last points. But one, the United States can't solve this problem alone.
Correct.
To work with the world, but the world can't do it with the United States. But to my colleagues on the other side, we're talking about the sacrifices people are being asked to make to address climate change. I would argue that the costs we're putting on people by not addressing are far greater. Food will cost more, as you touched on already. Insurance either costs more or is completely unavailable for people living in states. Cleaning up after major extreme weather events, from hurricanes, tornadoes, fires, droughts, every one of these is putting an economic burden on communities across the nation and across the world. And if we don't act now, if we don't lead, it's only going to get worse. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Kerry, thank you for being here. Sir, you're unelected, you're non-Senate confirmed bureaucrat, basically. Can you tell me what the cost of some of these climate agreements that you've gotten the American taxpayer in, how much it is going to cost them?
Well, Congressman,
Just in dollars.
the last thing I think I ever wanted to be in life was called bureaucrat, but
Well, we all are, so, you know.
well, speak for
I don't
yourself.
trust government. I am the government, so.
Let me just say that the cost, we all committed internationally, the world committed to put $100 billion into a fund that would help these other less developed countries be able to transition. We've never actually met that full 100. We've made some commitments. I mean, I can't run through them all. There are a lot of different bits and pieces to it. But by and large, we're seeing many of those things repay themselves many times over because of the transformation of our economy. And
But can you just tell me how much it's going to cost us? Is there surely some economic?
well, the
projections,
UN
dollars and cents?
finance, you're right, and sir, the UN finance analysis suggests that it will cost trillions of dollars, maybe $2.5 to $4.5 trillion a year between now and 2050 to actually affect the full transition to a clean energy economy. But that's not spending. Most of that is calculating private sector funding that will invest in these new technologies and in these new economic opportunities. For instance, we have to build out a grid, competent grid, with smart grid, so we can balance the distribution of energy in certain places.
But you understand, though, when they invest, I mean, this money just doesn't appear.
No, you're absolutely
They're going to charge
correct.
us. I was always in the state legislature, and somebody said, well, let's just put another nickel on a can of beer. And I was like, well, they're just going to pass that on to your constituents. So, I mean, I hope you understand. Let me move on a little bit. Can you explain why you and other members of the U.S. delegation to the United Nations Climate Conference in 2021 and 2022 did not follow the President's direction to track your carbon emissions?
Yes, it's unfortunate, but they ran into problems, apparently, in how it could get measured, how it gets accrued. It should be done, and we're trying to get people to sort of bear down.
Some of those bureaucrats?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. All right. You've also agreed that countries need to pay poor and developing countries for loss and damage due to climate change. Why do the good folks in East Tennessee that work very hard for their dollars need to pay for a flood in Africa or South Asia?
Well, we're not specifically paying for a flood in South Africa, though sometimes money may go to something like that. But the United States, as I said, is proudly the largest humanitarian donor in the world. And Republican and Democrat administrations alike have historically, I mean, look at what, President George W. Bush put a significant amount of money into the AIDS program in Africa. Ronald Reagan put significant amounts of money into denuclearizing and other things. I mean, we try to help the world. And you all, as the elected officials, have to balance to what degree, what's that amount going to be, and for what it's specifically going to go. But I think our country is enriched, and that our civilization is better for the fact that we do try to help people out in other places when they're in trouble. In Pakistan, when 30 million people were dislocated last year in an unprecedented flood, we put, I think, a few $100 million, I think it was ultimately, to help them recover under that.
Let me get on something else, Mr. Secretary. I apologize to you, but
that's all right.
We've said here that China is considered a developing country. That can be left for later debate. But how many American tax dollars do you intend to pay the Chinese Communist Party for climate change?
None. We're not paying them for that, and I don't think there's been one bilateral disbursement of money to China since 2018, when President Trump was President of the United States.
Right.
But the Biden administration has put zero into that.
Zero. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. Chair now recognizes Mr. Keating for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to wave on to this subcommittee on this important hearing today. Thank you to Secretary Kerry for being here. Your experience is well known. You've been in the executive branch at state government level. You've been in the Senate and the legislative sector for 28 years and Secretary of State. And I think perhaps in this morning's testimony, what we heard is a reflection of that to an extent, that the questions posed to you in your official capacity really are in the province of the Secretary of State of the United States, or some of the solutions are found in the legislative side in the House or the Senate. And you're here as an envoy. You're here because there's an important new position that was created. Because if you look at the importance of climate change right now, it's clear. It touches everything. If you were doing it in legislative committees, you could be easily testifying in front of the Armed Services Committee or the Intel Committee or Agricultural Committee or Energy and Commerce or Homeland or Appropriations. If you were dealing with cabinet responsibility, you could go through the whole spectrum of the President's cabinet and find how climate change is a directly affected and important piece of their function. So I think, given your background, our government is well served by having you in this role of envoy, bringing together all these fragments into one important position. And I thank you for that. But I want to give you the opportunity this morning, and as I'm at the last of the queue here, mercifully you might be thinking, but as I'm last in the queue, or pretty close, I'll say this. I just want to give you the chance. We talked about what the past has been, some people going back to creation. We've talked about the near-term effects of what we're dealing, the current effects of what we're doing. But, given the importance of dealing with this issue existentially, given the fact that scarcity of water creates wars, famine creates migration, everything that we have, and the imminence of things getting worse, could you take a few moments and just share some of the discussions you've had and the knowledge you've had on what the future is going to look like more concretely, not just deadlines for dates, but this is real stuff. This is a real, there's a real urgency that surrounds this. And can you take a few minutes on those matters of how this is going to affect the lives of everyone on this planet, how it's going to affect all those areas, and just share with us some of the things you've learned talking with others around the world.
Well, thank you, Congressman. Obviously, we're already seeing ways in which it's going to affect people. We've had every year, increasing storm intensity, storm damage. We're spending billions, literally, actually trillion. We had $1 trillion in damages, I think it was over the last 10 years. And that's money sort of thrown away in a sense. No, not that it's inappropriate. We should be helping people afterwards. But wouldn't it make a lot more sense if we were avoiding that damage in the first place or minimizing it? And you asked the question, what's it going to look like? That depends on what we decide to do. It's very obvious that there are huge threats here. Literally, food production for an entire continent could implode. Water is already diminishing. Last year, the Rhine River was down to inches. They had to stop navigation on the river because of it. You're seeing glaciers that are now absolutely predictable as to when they will be completely gone. And at the rate the ice is melting in the north and south of Antarctica and Arctica, there are dire predictions now about how that's moved forward by about 30 years at the pace at which it is vanishing. And parts of the Earth are warming much faster than other parts of the Earth. The Arctic, for instance, is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the Earth. Other places are. We're hitting heat levels in places that have never been lived by human beings on a regular basis. So, you know, what is life going to look like in the future? I'm an optimist. I'm genuinely an optimist about this. I'm watching what is now happening because of the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm seeing new processes, new seriousness of purpose among people who up until now never thought they had to be serious. So I have a sense that if we could come together and continue to accelerate the reduction of these emissions, we have an incredibly bright energy future staring us in the face. We can have clean energy. We can have energy that, if not renewable, is still clean in nuclear, whichever. You know, I look at the U.S. Navy. We've had ships that are nuclear, a small nuclear plant that have never had a sailor killed or lost or an accident, never had a spill. We know how to do this. We're just not choosing to do many of the things that are available to us to be able to do. So I think there's a huge, exciting set of possibilities for what will happen in this new economy that is going to develop. And it is going to develop, because I see the most serious of our entrepreneurs, the most successful of our entrepreneurs, the best of our financiers, all of them are now seized by this issue, and they're out there trying to push new processes, new technologies, new possibilities. And if we do what historically we humans have done, we're going to hopefully adapt and make the right choices.
Chair now recognizes.
With that optimistic note, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Welcome. It's great to see you again. Let me just say at the outset how grateful I was when you were Secretary of State, and legislation that I had introduced to help end the practice of child abduction. The bill passed twice. I named it after Sean and David Goldman. Sean was a young man who was abducted to Brazil. You changed the policy of the Obama administration, because before that they were against it. It sat in the Senate for 5 years, having sent it over several times. And I want to thank you for that. I had an oversight hearing on it just the other day in my committee, the Human Rights Committee, and we are mitigating the number of child abductions that are occurring and helping to bring people back. So thank you so much. It was your change of heart, not you, but the change within the administration that made that happen. So I'm very, very grateful. I would like to ask you, if you could, you know, I had a hearing last July. I've chaired 79 congressional hearings on human rights abuse in China. My most recent was yesterday. I chaired the China Commission. We had Enes Freedom, who used to play for the Celtics, was fired because he wore Free the Uyghurs on his shoes. He was fired because of that, and as a result, the NBA, and I think in a cowardly way, has told everybody in the NBA, just shut up, say nothing about human rights in China. And his testimony yesterday was absolutely compelling, and we're going to do a follow-up. We've invited, or are inviting, the NBA to come to that hearing. But last July, I chaired a hearing on the Lantos Commission, because we were out of power as Republicans, so Lantos, we could call hearings. It was on the exploitation of children and adults in the Democratic Republic of Congo who are mining cobalt and soon will be mining lithium. We found out, and I've raised this issue before, but the hearing just was a catalyst for we need to do more on this. Something on the order of 40,000 children are in these artisanal mines. They're dying. They're getting sick. There's cave-ins. They're inhaling all kinds of debris without proper. And who runs it all? The Chinese Communist Party. They own just about every mine there. All of the finished product, not finished, but the mined product of cobalt is sent to China for processing, and then it goes into EVs by way of the batteries. And it seems to me that no matter where anybody comes down on the advisability of having more electric vehicles, it should not be on the backs of African children, be they in DR Congo or anywhere else. And 70% of all the cobalt, as you know, does come from the DR Congo. I introduced a bill, H.R. 4443, that would look to enforce the Tariff Act, Sections 307, and require an all-out effort to try to protect those children and those adults from this egregious human rights practice by the Chinese Communist Party. I did meet with our ambassador, and it was a very good meeting, Lucy Tamlin, a couple of weeks ago to the DR Congo, and I had known that they're talking about an MOU, but the problem with the MOU is just aspirational. It's like sense of the Congress or sense of the Senate language. There's no teeth in it. And I'm asking you today, I know you are very much in favor, as is the administration, of electric vehicles, but they should not be, the supply chain should not be contingent on whether or not we get it from the DR Congo or, by way of the Chinese Communist Party. Please take a look at the bill. We've got to protect those kids and those adults. They are dying. We had people talk about the lung diseases that they're getting. And these kids have no health care, so they just die. And there's beatings that are occurring by Chinese Communist Party soldiers who are deployed there. And unfortunately, the DR Congo leadership just basically looks the other way because they're getting perhaps even paid off. If you could speak to the issue of the cobalt and soon the lithium that will also be coming out of the DR Congo.
Well, Congressman Smith, thank you very much for your persistent, over the years, work on all of this. You've been really tenacious and super focused on it. It was a pleasure to work with you on it before. Let me just say to you that we have an MOU with the DRC and Zambia on advancing critical minerals now, and to add processing capacity there. So we're focused on it, and I will convey your thoughts to the appropriate bureau in the department out of this, but we thank you for that.
I would appreciate that. And again, the MOU is a good idea, but it doesn't go far enough. It is all aspirational. And again, when the Chinese Communist Party is paying people, high government officials, and there's suggestions that that is happening, I would love for the DR Congo to own it all and to spread the wealth that is gleaned from that to their own people.
Yeah, I
instead of it
understand.
all going and being processed by the PRC, where another slave labor type process takes place once it gets to China. So
Thank you.
please take a look at the bill, and I hope you can support it.
You got it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Huizenga for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Secretary Kerry. I appreciate the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions. I'm going to, before I get into the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment and some other projects, I do want to touch base on nuclear energy. That has been somewhat controversial. Obviously, ensuring we have sufficient base load generation is significant. I served in the Michigan legislature, spent 6 years on the Energy and Technology Committee. I serve on the Financial Services Committee and do a lot of work with the development banks and have over my tenure here. And I have in my district potentially one of the first projects. It's called the Palisades Power Plant in Covert, Michigan, that may be restarted. It's a program that is new. It was on the brink of decommissioning and could come back. Obviously the United States is working to reassert itself as a global energy leader, I think it's wise, as we saw with what was happening in Europe, that we break our own as well as our allies' dependence on energy resources of global bad actors. So I'm curious, do you believe that that projects like Palisades and others that potentially are on there would help us achieve these goals and reduce CO2 emissions? Or what's your view on restarting some of these nuclear power plants?
The Biden administration is very proactive on the nuclear front. We believe that nuclear, that you can't really reach the targets that have been set without some nuclear.
Okay. All right. I want to, I think I've got about 3 minutes here, so I'm going to try and move quickly. COP26, you and Romanian President Klaus Iohannis pledged that Romania would build a small modular nuclear reactor project in which the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment invested $14 million. Are there any concerns that your policy and willingness to or potential willingness to forego financial viability of projects to satisfy the environmental side? I mean, are you looking at the business model as you are involved in these?
Of course, it's imperative.
Okay. All right. I want to move to a question regarding sort of your scope and authority. I think this is a new position, very new to a lot of people, including those of us that are constitutionally obligated to have oversight of those things. And I'm curious, does your funding, just making sure I understand, does your funding to fund your 45 full-time equivalents, your FTEs, as well as your salary and your travel, does that all come out of the State Department?
Yes.
Okay. Yet you do not report to Secretary Blinken, correct?
Well, sure I do. I mean,
but
as a friend of mine.
I'm not trying to create a trap.
No,
here.
no,
I'm
no.
just
I know
trying
you're
to
not.
understand.
I know you're not. I'm just trying to say, formally, in terms of strict legal accountability,
Okay.
I report to the President of the United States.
Okay,
But
that's great.
Informally, obviously, I keep the Secretary completely. There's only one Secretary.
That's informed. Yes.
We keep him fully informed.
And having served in
I
that
consult
position,
with him.
Reclaiming my time on this.
Sure, go ahead.
You certainly served in that position. In that position, you had the authority and the ability to negotiate on behalf of the United States, and had ability to bind it or speak on behalf of the president. What are the scopes of your duties with this, and under what authority are you able to go in and be able to all intents and purposes, negotiate on behalf of the United States?
Well, I'm negotiating. I'm formally charged by the President of the United States and his executive authority, and the appropriate congressional notification and approval, an executive order, et cetera, that created the job. So we have had special envoys for years and years and years, and we've used envoys.
I don't think anything with quite this scope.
Well, that may be because of the scope of the problem.
Sure. All right. I need to hit one last thing here. In March 9, 2022, an email from the Specs Office Senior Director of Climate Finance, the official wrote that a call or meeting should be held with you soon, saying, quote, I would also suggest a call or meeting soon with JK to update him on FY 22 and 23, focusing on all the elements we can't put on paper. What are those elements that couldn't be put on paper?
I have no idea.
So it sounds like we need to pull him in to ask that question?
Well,
or
I
are
don't
you
know.
willing to go ask and find out
I
what
would
exactly he was
personally, absolutely. I'm not sure what it is that couldn't be put on paper.
All right, and I know my time is expiring here, but it's my understanding that there is a FOIA request for the fiscal 2022 that State Department has said they will not be able to fulfill until 2025? April of 2025. Does that sound right to you?
No, it doesn't sound right, but it sounds accurate.
Would that be acceptable? You and your senatorial.
No, that's not acceptable, and I believe it was an algorithm that kicked that out kind of crazily. Maybe that's a metaphor for other kinds of challenges, but no, I'm confident that I can't imagine any FOIA that would take that long.
So you'll pledge to work with us on expediting that?
Well, we will communicate to the office that you're asking and that it's important to try to get to it as soon as possible.
Mr. Secretary, I know you have travel, and we have one more member to ask questions.
Sure.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Pfluger for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to wave onto this committee. Secretary, good to see you. I want to follow up on a couple of things. Before I get to that, I know you're traveling to China. I hope that will include touting American energy. China has rapidly produced coal plants over the past couple of years. They are concerned about baseload capacity. They are concerned about reality, and yet we have administration officials who are touting the Chinese Communist Party as the leader around the world in combating climate change, which is just incredulous and it's nonsense. So I hope that on your trip there that you'll tout American LNG. If we were to replace the coal plants that China has, we could reduce the CO2 footprint immediately overnight by about 50%. So following up on my colleague here, in your position as Special Envoy, you made it clear that you do negotiate, on behalf of the President. But let me ask you this. Do you have the authority to bind agreements?
No.
Okay, so you're negotiating, and those binding agreements are the responsibility.
They're not binding. They don't become a binding agreement unless they're ratified by the Congress, by the Senate. And it's not a treaty, mind you. It's an executive agreement. So it's binding between that administration but not beyond that. Okay. It doesn't have the force of law and international law.
In this position, do you advise President Biden on energy policy?
In terms of global challenges and U.S. interest, yes.
Did you advise the President in recent months to travel to Riyadh and to ask OPEC to increase production of oil and gas?
No, I did not.
So Secretary Granholm testified before me on my primary committee in Energy and Commerce and was a little wiggly on whether or not she was the primary advisor on energy policy for this administration.
Well, she is in regards to writ large the energy policy. Sure, she is primary.
I'm glad to hear that answer. And I'm trying to figure out who advised the President to go to Riyadh and ask for an increase in production of oil and gas. Let me ask you this. In previous times where we've had the opportunity to have you before this committee, I've asked the question, do the renewable sources of energy like wind and solar, let's just limit it to those, do they have the ability to provide baseload capacity in this country?
Backup baseload, no, but some primary they could be part of it. Yeah. But can they on their own guarantee that when the wind isn't blowing and the sun ain't shining? No, that we all know.
Well, I think that's good, and I'm glad to hear that because that's really the fight that we're in.
But with battery, there's ways to make that work. Germany is heading to a very high percentage of renewable, others are.
I'm glad you brought up Germany. I'm actually very concerned about the path the German government has taken.
So are we.
Because this repower plan is completely ignoring nuclear, and instead of having Russian natural gas, which does provide baseload capacity, they're moving in a direction that could put them in a very bad spot with regards to baseload capacity. When we look at the administration's desire, specifically of the EPA, to have a mandate for EVs in this country, and there's a couple of different timelines. How much electricity does the United States use on an annual basis right now?
I don't know exactly where we are right now.
Okay.
I don't think
it's 4,000 terawatts. How much additional demand would we need if we got to, let's just call it 50% EV mandate, 287 million cars on the road?
Probably double.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
That's actually what the Secretary of Energy said. I think it's less than that. But here's my point, is that I've questioned the EPA Director, Regan, Secretary Granholm, Mr. Goffman, other high-ranking officials in the administration, and I don't believe anybody has done the math on this. And so there's multiple balls in the air here when we're talking about energy. And I don't think anybody in the administration has actually, I know nobody has done the math on this because we can't get a straight answer. And so when you go to China and talk to the Chinese about baseload capacity and the power that's required there, I think they're doing the math on it, and they're building coal plants to meet that demand.
Actually, I don't, with all due respect, I know you represent a district that has tremendous wind and the Permian Basin and so forth, and so you have a lot of knowledge of this. But I think there was a recent article showing that it was, in fact, renewables that kind of helped Texas through the hurdle of this heat because of its reliability and where the energy comes from. But let me just say to you that I think I know the math has been done, and I know that there's a clarity that as the number of electric vehicles go up, as you electrify the country in various ways, you're going to need a lot more power. And that's precisely why the administration is trying to move on the permitting for many of the transmission lines that are essential to being able to get that power out there. So we have about 2,000 gigawatts now of potential power in the queue that is not able to be deployed. So if we can deploy more rapidly, we will fill the void. We will meet the need.
Mr. Chairman, I need 10 seconds. We are going to enter into a crisis in this country if we do not use the resources that are primary sources of energy. I am not an all-of-the-above fan anymore. I am a best-of-the-above fan. And, Mr. Secretary, please advocate for the best of the above in this country, which starts with primary sources like liquefied natural gas that come out of the Permian Basin that I represent. And it's critical that we lead in the world, or we will be cold, dark, and...
Do you also believe it's critical that they capture the emissions if they're going to make them?
These companies are doing just that. We've reduced emissions, harmful emissions, ones that are listed in the Clean Air Act.
And you believe that can be brought to scale
we have scaled
and be affordable?
We've scaled it in the Permian Basin. We've gone from 1 million barrels a day just 12 or 13 years ago to 5.5 million barrels a day, 43% of the total production in the United States. And in doing that, we have also reduced harmful emissions by over 40%.
Well, that's great. And look, I've had conversations with many of the CEOs of our biggest companies, asking them and trying to get fully knowledgeable about what's doable and what isn't here. The key is, folks, we've got to meet the target of the reduction of emissions that we know will help us avoid the consequences of what's happening. That's the key. And I'm not picking which way it's going to happen. I want to see it happen, and we'll go from there.
Let's use the best of the above. Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me wave on. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pfluger. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your time today. Thank you for your answers on this committee. We do not approve of engaging in personalities with the witnesses, though it is not a rule. It's not something that we approve of. So you have our commitment.
Can I just mention one thing, though, Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely.
And thank you for your stewardship of this hearing, which I really appreciate. Because I didn't get a chance to answer Congressman Waltz, I think it was, whoever was asking about the airplanes.
You have a couple minutes. As long as you have time, you have a couple of minutes.
Because it's trivial in my mind, but I want to make it clear because it keeps sort of resurfacing. We are not, I have not, President Biden is not, we are not saying to people, you should not fly. That's not the message. The message is, let's find a way to be able to make sure when we fly, we're not leaving emissions that we can't capture, or we aren't capturing them, or aren't avoiding them in the first place by creating sustainable aviation fuel. So we're looking to technology to help us. And when somebody says, well, you're asking people to sacrifice this and that. No, we don't believe that this transition actually requires sacrifice. We think it will wind up making life better, cleaner, healthier, more secure. Our country will be strengthened with clean energy and some of our own supply that avoids many of these other problems. So, you know, this battle over the airplane or whatever is kind of ridiculous and not relevant to what we're really trying to achieve here. You know, we're not saying to people you shouldn't fly. You should fly, but let's find a way to make sure that's not contributing emissions. Just as when you drive, we don't want to be contributing emissions. Or when you have a building, buildings are a big source of emissions. We have to build them in a way that they're not contributing pollution, which is in effect what it is, in ways that hurts people. So that's our hope, that we can get on to a sort of more serious, how do we solve this problem, which I think is self-evident to anybody whose eyes are open and whose mind is open at the same time.
I appreciate your closing thoughts.
Thank you, sir.
Just to wrap up a few thoughts for myself, I would say this. I started with some questions myself. I did not get all the answers that I want, but it is important that your office, every congressional office, that they have transparency. It's important that we know what your mission statement is, what you're trying to do on behalf of the American people, whether every American agrees with you or not. It's important for us to know those that are working in your office, what backgrounds they come from, the ways in which individuals are vetted. For me personally, there's various kinds of power that we see the United States of America wielding. When it's hard power, I think it's important that we put the fear of God into those that challenge us. When it's soft power, I think it's important that we look at every way in which that soft power may help Americans thrive or may help our adversaries, our enemies, or those that wish to rise up against us to potentially thrive, and take that accordingly into account. And I hope that you do that. In that, I would just say this. I wish you well on your travels. I wish you safety on your travels. I thank you for your testimony. Other members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witness, and we would ask that you do respond to those in writing. And I will now recognize my colleague here, Mr. Crow, for 5 minutes of closing remarks, if he has any.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Kerry, for your testimony and your time here today. First of all, I just want to rebut a couple of themes that were prevalent throughout the hearing. It is wrong to say that your office and the State Department and folks that work with you and for you have been nothing but transparent. Just yesterday, you produced 700 pages of material in response to requests from this committee. And you have been, in my view, nothing but transparent and open, including today, spending well over 2 hours answering everybody's questions, staying until the very end, and ensuring that everybody had their opportunity, and I thank you for that. It is also wrong to say that engagement with the world, including with our adversaries and those who we don't have common ground in all areas, is in any way a show of weakness. It is actually a show of strength to engage with the world, and to do so from a position of confidence, right? We don't have to have this crisis of confidence where we shy away from tough conversations and tough situations, and you have shown that very clearly, and I applaud your effort, including today, going to have very hard conversations with people that we have very deep-seated disagreements with, because that's in the best interest of the American people. And it is also wrong to be the subject of personal attacks, and I'm grateful to the chairman for actually calling out that is not the course and conduct of this committee to engage in personalities. So thank you, Chairman, for mentioning that, because you have been a public servant to this nation in a variety of capacities for your adult life, including your own military service as well, of which we find common faith and fidelity in, and I'm grateful for that. There is this saying in politics that when you can't attack the message, when you have nothing to say, you attack the messenger. And unfortunately, you are at the brunt end of that today. So, we will respond accordingly. But thank you for being calm and for staying focused on the important issues. But these are substantive issues, and the American people deserve a full and robust discussion about it. And you have adequately outlined for the committee and for the American people that this is in our best economic interest. The economic future of this country relies on us making this transition. There will be more jobs, a stronger economy, a more resilient economy. That our safety relies on us making this transition in reducing our risk to flood, to wildfire, to pandemic, to crop collapse, and so many other major crises that our world and our country face. And it's in our national security interest that we make this transition, that we will be a safer and more prosperous country if we engage globally, if we win this strategic competition around the world, and we address these national security issues. So thank you for making that strong case, and I join the chairman in wishing you well on your travels, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Congressman, I didn't know I had the